All right, so we're constantly surrounded by debates over fake news, censorship, and media bias, right? But what if we looked at journalism from a completely different philosophical starting point? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating source text that outlines the theoretical framework for how media operates within an Islamic Caliphate. It's a really detailed look into a system that approaches free speech and state accountability from a fundamentally different baseline than secular systems. We're going to rely strictly on the provided text to map out exactly how this media structure is supposed to function.
To unpack this objectively, we'll break the framework into 6 logical sections. We're looking at West versus Islam media concepts, rights and limits, holding government accountable, rules for exposing corruption, historical media, specifically the role of poets, and finally, shaping public opinion.
So let's jump straight into Section 1, West versus Islam media concepts.
Okay, we're diving into this by first looking at how the text challenges the idea that the Western press is truly free. The source highlights a pretty common critique. It argues that rather than being an independent watchdog, mainstream media is largely controlled by a wealthy elite, making it, as commentator Owen Jones puts it, merely a pillar of a politically motivated establishment.
To define the Western secular concept of free speech, the source points to a widely held belief, summed up well by Noam Chomsky. Basically, in a society where humans determine their own rules, you've got to allow all speech, literally even the views you completely despise. The source text we're analyzing explicitly and entirely rejects this secular baseline.
And you know, this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophical divide we're dealing with. The text states that in this framework, speech rights aren't defined by human consensus at all. Instead, the right to speech and the very strict limits on what's acceptable are granted solely by the creator and defined by Sharia law. So it's a massive, fundamental shift from human-centric to divine-centric rules.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rights and Limits. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. According to the source, the foundation of media in this system doesn't rest on freedom of expression just for its own sake. It actually rests on a religious obligation. It's built entirely on the concept of enjoining the good, known as maruf, and forbidding the evil, known as munkar. The text argues that the media's primary job is literally to fulfill this collective societal duty.
So, practically speaking, the government doesn't hold a monopoly here. Any citizen can set up a newspaper or broadcast station. But they have to adhere to a really strict code. This code explicitly forbids publishing sensitive security information, slander, or incitement. It also completely bans racism, insulting religious beliefs, or propagating what the text calls depraved cultures. Essentially, the platform is yours, but the boundaries are rigidly defined by that collective duty we just talked about.
All right, Section 3, holding government accountable.
Let's see how this framework addresses keeping the rulers in check, because this is a big one. A central concept here is mazlamah, which translates to government oppression or unjust acts committed by the state. The text heavily emphasizes that the media has full constitutional rights to investigate and publish findings on mazlamah. A journalist doing this is completely protected. They can operate without fear of arrest or persecution, mostly because holding the ruler accountable is seen as a super high religious duty.
And to prove this isn't just some modern concept being retrofitted into the text, the author points to deep historical precedents. Like, upon taking leadership, the very first caliph explicitly asked the public to correct his mistakes. The source uses this to show that public scrutiny of the state is baked into the very origins of the system from day one.
This is then immediately reinforced by subsequent leadership echoing that exact same idea. The text argues that in the era of early leadership, rulers completely submitted to the right of the Muslim community, the Ummah, to watch over them. So political accountability is framed not just as a right, but a deeply embedded historical tradition. Which brings us to Section 4, Rules for Exposing Corruption.
Now, what is super interesting about this is how the source maps out incredibly strict rules for uncovering corruption, which is way different than what you'd see in Western tabloids. Basically, if someone commits a sin publicly, the media still shouldn't publicize it in order to prevent spreading lewdness. If a sin is a secret and only harms the individual, the media absolutely cannot expose it because Islam prohibits spying. But, and this is the absolute key, if a secret sin harms the state or wider society, the media is actually obligated to expose it.
The text justifies this singular exception for state security using a really powerful historical example from the early days of the state. Basically, when a citizen overheard a secret conspiracy by a hypocrite to undermine the leadership, he reported it, even though spying is generally totally forbidden.
This establishes the legal precedent. Exposing secret corruption is only permitted and actually required when it's absolutely essential to the well-being and security of the state.
Okay, let's look at Section 5, Historical Media, the Poets.
When we say the word media, we usually just picture screens and printing presses, right? But the source traces a really fascinating evolution here. Back in the 7th century, media was entirely verbal, driven by word of mouth and, crucially, poetry. Moving into the 8th to 13th centuries, poets essentially functioned as state media organs, publicizing policies and shaping narratives. It's kind of amazing to realize that that exact same function has seamlessly evolved into the newspapers, TV stations, and citizen journalists we see on social media today.
To cement this point, the author highlights early historical roles, describing what was essentially the very first media office. The chief poet used his craft as psychological warfare, basically verbal bullets sprayed at enemy tribes to mock their cowardice and counter their propaganda. It was the original state media campaign, which goes to show that controlling the narrative has honestly always been a vital tool of statecraft.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Shaping Public Opinion.
To really demonstrate the ultimate power of shaping public opinion, the text uses a historical example from 1962 Iran. During the rule of the Shah, the regime attempted to introduce laws that were deemed un-Islamic. According to the source, despite the presence of a pretty brutal secret police, religious scholars unified public opinion through collective protests, speeches, and telegrams. This unified pressure successfully forced the regime to back down. The big takeaway here is that when public opinion is genuinely galvanized through collective media voices, even deeply entrenched regimes are forced to retreat.
And that leaves us with a really profound question to end this explainer. What we've seen today is a highly structured framework that entirely rejects secular liberalism in favor of divine limits. It prioritizes societal morality and state security while still mandating severe accountability for its rulers. But it begs the question, how does any society perfectly balance state security, rigid moral frameworks, and the power of the press to keep leaders in check? It's a universal challenge, And understanding diverse perspectives like the one we've explored today is absolutely crucial to grasping how different civilizations attempt to solve it. Thanks for watching this explainer. Keep questioning the frameworks around you.